So now we've reached past the halfway point in the tutorial series because we're on to tutorial 6, and this is the stage, a new stage that we call mapping. And it's a pretty pivotal stage of the business journey actually, and it's really totally different to the work that we've been doing during the reconnaissance stage. However, that work really does now help because it will be used, and we will be using it to really stimulate your creative perception. And if you've not actually read your mapping logbook yet, I think it might be wise here to pause and read it through just to get an idea before we start. Because by now you should have at least an idea about a business dynamic that we call 3D relationships. And mapping is the way that we use the journey metaphor as a means of grasping this all-important business concept. It'll take a while to grasp this concept, but once it does gel, the results, to quote one business owner who has used it, the results can be synaptic. You suddenly get what a business really is. And basically what we're concerned with here is an element within one of your completed reconnaissance logs, which can have several relationships with other elements in one of the other or more of the other three logs. Now, some of these are obvious, and others are a little bit more obscure at first. And in fact, those more obscure ones you'll probably only pick up the second or third time around. So, until you get the hang of this, don't try to force and squeeze out as many relationships as you can. Just tackle the most obvious ones. And after retracing your early reconnaissance steps, which we referred to earlier, updating them with any insights or feedbacks from the conduct of your business, after that you can then revisit mapping, and then you'll get probably some more 3D relationships that you spot. So you determine really whether the map that you build using the mapping logs, whether they're just 2 or 3, or whether you finish up with a dozen or so of these individual logs. So let's take a first pass at a mapping log, and it might be an idea to hold a picture in your mind, if you will, of the main expedition sends out a scout who sort of looks back and views the main group of the business from across the terrain that they have to cross. So what we're trying to do here is to establish a view of each of the elements in reconnaissance from the perspective of another element, but from a different quadrant. So here's our example log here. So follow through how we do this, and the log for every mapping task is exactly the same, so it's worth taking a few minutes to understand it. This is the only log sheet that you'll be using, and it's used for every single relationship that you identify. In the top left hand corner of each sheet we enter the quadrant that we want to map, and in the example here I've chosen my vehicle quadrant. And to the right of this is enter the element from that quadrant against which I'll identify and test relationships with elements from different quadrants. So what I'll finish up with is a number of mapping logs for every quadrant that I work through. And I'll have one mapping log for each element that I identify as having a relationship with other elements. In other words, within vehicle, I'll have one log sheet for each element that I identify as having relationships with elements from other quadrants. You just have to let this sink in. It takes a while. But in the example here, it's the vehicle element I've identified for this particular log, and it's the product is the element. I would then go on to consider each vehicle element in turn to see if I can identify any relationships with elements from other quadrants. And really, I'm just interested in the ones that immediately occur to them. If none are obvious right away, that's okay. I just tackle the next quadrant. More relationships will come to me later in the program, and I'll come back to them. So it's a lot to take in, but run through it slowly a couple of times and you get it. For my own mapping exercise for product, I've identified a number of elements from other quadrants that I believe have a relationship either with or an impact on the product. These are customer, competition, and research from territory. Plus, I've identified that I have relationships between my product from my vehicle quadrant with the promoter and designer and a financier from my crew quadrant. There are actually a few less obvious ones, but we'll get back to those later. So to complete my first pass of the product mapping sheet at this point, I now need to enter some keywords in the last column to give me the headlines of each relationship. What's the basis for the relationship? For example, what are the keywords when I try to view my product element from the standpoint of my customer? From competition. So what's the relationships that I view product from competition? To complete, as I say, to complete my log sheet, I just need to give the headlines of each relationship. And those headlines, or those keywords, could be those that arose when I was completing the reconnaissance logs. So I simply just go back to my reconnaissance logs and I write in a few keywords from the stuff that I entered there. Or I can think of fresh ones that spring to mind that better describe these 3D relationships that I've spotted between the quadrants. At the end of the whole mapping exercise, I'll have a series of logs, potentially one for each reconnaissance element, but more likely, certainly for the first time, I'll only have mapping logs for the more obvious ones. So that's the only log sheet that you require for your mapping tasks. It's a concept that is easier to get your head around if you do a couple and try it out and study the notes in your handbook and read your mapping logbook, where you will get a lot more support. And as you've seen, the mapping log is much more free format than the logs in reconnaissance. It requires more effort from you and more contribution from you. And I think because of that, you would probably gain by involving your crew in this particular stage. So it's your decision which elements you see as interrelated. One or two of them maybe is all that you see this time, and that's fine, just enter them. Don't try to invent them or construct them, only the ones that are obvious. You will see more as you get further into the business journey. So I would suggest that to get going with anyway, you look at the elements within your vehicle from the perspective of each of the elements in your territory and think about if there are any relationships and what you can do in terms of keywords to map those relationships. And another one that I think you might want to think about is having a look at the destination from the point of view of your crew. Remember, Here we're just providing tutorials, so I'm not suggesting that this is the sort of pace you race through in terms of completing these logs. So, in particular mapping, you need to spend time studying your manual and the logbook on mapping and the handbook. And sometimes the stages take a few days on the first pass as we sort of get the hang of how to do them. But they can take a number of weeks when constantly backtracking and updating them and completing them in more detail. It's almost certain that mapping actually will throw up tasks that you say, well, actually, now that I've done this mapping, I really need to do some further reconnaissance work. And remember that we only tackle each stage superficially at first, so do go back often. And we found that it's pretty normal that later stages are providing new insights and improvements to the earlier stages.